My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be discussing a very highly requested topic. We are going to be talking about monster kinks. And monster kinks are a fascinating area of BDSM where there is overlap with BDSM, and I can't wait to talk about all of that. But there are some terms I want to introduce to you all first to make sure we can have a comprehensive conversation about this. So one term you'll oftentimes see when it comes to monster kinks is something called teratophilia. And I will admit I had some trouble figuring out an accurate pronunciation for this term. So if you know how to say it differently than me and you're like, this is absolutely the correct way to say it, feel free to sound off in the comments down below. But from what I can glean, the pronunciation for this is teratophilia. And what teratophilia is it is a paraphilia, which is an intense arousal to an atypical thing. And it has two different definitions. The first definition is having an attraction to monsters, and the other definition is having an attraction to monstrous or deformed people. And that's very problematic. I will say I don't love that. People who have a relationship to teratophilia, like that second definition, will say it's something where they have the ability to look past societal beauty standards. Other people are going to say it is objectifying people that have physical birth defects or have amputations done on them, things like that. And that's a conversation for another day with probably a more experienced person than I. But just know, for this video, I'm going to be using that first usage of teratophilia. I think that is what makes the most sense for the context of this video. And also, if you prefer, if you like more raunchy Tumblr terminology, this is also what a monster effer is. I really hate that I can't actually say the full word here on YouTube anymore, but monster effer. If you saw that stuff on Tumblr, you know what we're probably going to be getting into here. So to be very clear, I am talking about when people have kinks for creatures like vampires or orcs or elves or demons or mermaids, that kind of a thing, okay? If you're into the idea of being with a werewolf, congrats, you may in fact be a person with a monster kink. So interestingly, what I found very quickly in researching this is that compared to a lot of the other kinks I talk about on this channel, where maybe like 1 to 2% of people ever actually do it, monster kinks, having fantasies about monsters, is incredibly common. According to Justin LaMiller, in the survey research he did for his book, Tell Me What You Want, he discovered that, quote, overall, 33% of my participants said they had fantasized about sex with a mythical creature before. However, women, and in particular, women who identified as anything other than heterosexual, were more likely to have these fantasies than were men. Among heterosexual women who had fantasized about mythical creatures, 63% of them reported fantasizing about vampires. This was followed by werewolves at 9% and demons, 8%, with no other creature registering above 5%. The numbers for heterosexual men were quite different. While vampires still topped the list, 26% had fantasized about them. They were followed closely by demons, 17%, mermaids, 12%, nymphs, 11%, and elves, 9%. I should mention that creature fantasies were actually most common among persons who identified as gender non-binary. More than half, 56%, of non-binary participants reported such fantasies. Again, vampires were the most fantasized about creature, 29%, followed by demons, 17%, werewolves, 13%, and elves, 6%. And personally, I find it fascinating that across the board, universally, the most common monster to fantasize about is a vampire. I guess vampires are just eternally popular, and I would love to know why exactly that is. But if you want to know more about vampire kinks in the BDSM community, vampire roleplay, and a little bit about the vampire community, you can find a video I did on that a Halloween or two ago, linked down below in the description box. Now, if you are not somebody who is into monsters, I imagine you're like, okay, wait, back up here. People want to do what now with demons? Like, let's stop and process that. Like, why could it possibly be a thing to fantasize about being with a monster? Surely that has to be some kind of completely outlandish kink. And because this is so common, I think it might be tempting to spin some theories with evolutionary psychology about how it's somehow evolutionarily advantageous for reproductive purposes and spreading our genes to have fantasies about monsters, but I am not convinced it is so easily explained. And as John Hogan put it in Scientific American, here's what I love about Monster Prawn. It's a wonderfully wacky reminder that human sexuality is too weird, wild, and woolly to be captured by modern science, and especially by theories that reduce our behaviors to genes. But even if you leave the evopsych and behavioral genetics on the shelf, I do have many theories about why so many people are into monster kinks. And these, of course, are all going to be individual. Different people are going to be into monster kinks or have teratophilia for different reasons, but these are some of the possible reasons why. One of them would be the so-called Coolidge effect, which explains why novelty is so associated with arousal. A lot of people have an increased in interest when it comes to things that are novel or new for them to experience. Monsters might be titillating for people like this because, well, it offers a deviation from the usual humdrum of only ever fantasizing about boring old humans. Also, having a fantasy about a monster as opposed to a human offers a very clear separation between fantasy and reality. Like, if you're fantasizing about that monster, that fantasy can never slippery slope its way into reality because monsters, spoiler alert, don't actually exist. Being able to have a quick out from that guilt or shame is a very motivating tool for a lot of people, because then you don't have to worry about the social stigma attached to fantasizing about the wrong kind of sex or wanting to have too much sex, because hey, you're thinking about a monster that can never really happen for real. You don't actually want to have a real person overpower you or do things to your body all night and all day, because it's somehow different enough from doing things with a human being to where, like, hey, you don't really have to mentally worry about it as much, because it's not like you're really gonna ever actually act on that in real life. And on that note of being overpowered by a monster, domination and submission fantasies are also very common with monster kinks, and that totally makes sense. We have tons of tropes about powerful monsters, like the brutish beast coming into your tiny village and stealing you away in the middle of the night to take you back to their lair. Or we have the idea of the charming, seductive vampire who can use their superior mind and intellect, and even maybe things like hypnosis, to force you to follow their every command. And using that as a context for wanting to be submissive allows that to be a little bit easier to process, right? Like, if you're dealing with a vampire that has the ability to hypnotize you, or an 8-foot tall massive beast, you know, of course you're not going to be able to fight back against them. Of course you have to submit, because you're not going to be able to overpower them. They're going to be the one to overpower you. And also with domination fantasies as well, you can also fantasize about being that overpowering, overwhelming creature that has the superior charm and intellect, or the brute strength to be able to force someone to submit to you. It's not only ever fantasizing about just submitting to a creature. And also you can have fantasies about being with a creature like this that is not just like purely about submission. I think one other common trope here is it's essentially the most extreme version of like, he's a bad boy, but I can fix him, that you can have in a fantasy. Like, really, just look at like Beauty and the Beast fan fiction. You've probably got it all figured out just from that. Like, it's very clear that for a lot of people, their desire and their fantasies about monsters are maybe less about it literally being a monster, but the type of personality and the extremeness of that personality that a monster can safely represent in a fantasy world. And the kink connection to monsters doesn't just stop with dominance and submission. Bondage and sadomasochism can also be a really big part of having a monster kink. Like, think of King Kong on the Empire State Building, right? Like, if you are playing around with a monster in your fantasy world, then of course they're going to slap you around and pin you down and wrestle you and bite you and throw you in a cage like a bird to entertain them, or maybe tie you to a tree to save for later. Like, that's gonna happen because they're a monster. And so you can have a playground to explore those fantasies in, where the context is doing it with a monster because that's their very nature. And that might feel safer than exploring it mentally with a human being, because a human being has to consciously choose to want to hurt you, whereas with a monster, they're doing it because it's their instinct and they simply can't help themselves. But having a fantasy about monsters isn't always just about kink. It can also be about having an overactive imagination. A lot of people stumble into their kinks because they're really big daydreamers. And of course, if you are somebody who daydreams a lot, you are more likely to have a more diverse and robust inner fantasy world. And when it comes to monsters, you know, maybe you watched a certain movie or read a book and there was a beastly main character, even like a side character you were really into for some reason. And you start thinking to yourself, well, what if we got into a romantic scenario? What would happen there? Again, fan fiction. Pretty easy thing to point to for like, why does this happen? How does it happen? There you go. Fan fiction, everyone. But also, with fantasies involving monsters, it's clear that we need to point out the connection between fear and arousal here, because monsters, of course, are oftentimes scary creatures, and the idea of being afraid of your partner or being in a situation that is frightening alongside somebody that has an intense attraction to you can elevate the scenario. Having fear go alongside arousal can make both feel more intense, and fear can lead to arousal. It's something that a lot of people have anecdotal evidence for, and I actually have a video I'm doing, I don't know if it'll come out before or after this one, where I talk about fear play in more detail, and we'll talk about it more then, but just know fear and arousal go together, and monster kinks are one way that can be expressed. And for those who fall more on the teratophilia side of the spectrum, there's also the fact that for a lot of people that have atypical arousal, that interest was formed relatively early on, and we certainly have a lot of media, even stuff that younger people consume, that contains monsters. Right? We have Halloween costumes and books and movies and anime, like especially around Halloween, it is wall-to-wall monster time, and all it takes is a couple of accidental early interactions. We don't really understand what's going on with your body to suddenly have a kink formed that you didn't necessarily intend to have happen. And there's many other theories out there for why people have kinks. That is just one of them, but it is a connection that a lot of people happen to make. I will also say anecdotally, for people that are asexual, if they do have fantasies, a lot of us tend to have fantasies about monsters versus other human beings, because monsters aren't real people and they aren't actually subject to the nature of our lack of attraction that a human being might. So it might be a more easy way to explore ideas of attraction and desire, because monsters are a totally different game from human beings, and I would love to know any research that might look into asexuality and monster kinks. I wasn't able to find any yet, but give it enough time and I'm pretty sure it'll happen. I'll also say that for my experience being in the kink community, just about every kinky woman I know and just about every queer person I know has at least sometimes had an interest in monster kinks, and most of them have a literal entire toy chest full of toys to go alongside that. So clearly, regardless of the reason or the source, monster kinks are here to stay and also quite popular. Now, I do need to outline here a few things that monster kink absolutely is not. If you have a monster kink, that is not the same thing as being attracted to animals. Very, very different things here. I don't know of any study that shows that there is any link between those two different desires or that having one leads to the other. They are separate. Usually with a monster kink, for example, with vampires, you have a creature that is basically entirely humanoid except for a few maybe minor differences, and they are sentient and able to consent, or in the fantasy, they're able to do that. Whereas with animals, with like a pet or something, that is not a factor at all, and also the mental motivations and desires between these two different things are usually vastly different from each other. They're just not the same, okay? You're gonna have to take my word for it on that one. They're not connected. No evidence indicates that the two are connected. Also, not the same thing as being a furry either. There's a lot of overlap between having a monster kink and being a furry. A lot of furries are also really into monsters, but what I discovered while researching for this video is for people that are on like forums for monster kink related stuff, a lot of them have rules that say no furry content, which I find fascinating. So with furry stuff, that tends to be much more anthropomorphic. It's about turning an animal into a more human creature, whereas with monster kinks, most of the monsters are already humanoid and there is not the same level of anthropomorphization. Anthropomorphization? I guess that would probably be it. Anyway, just doesn't involve the same level of that as with furries. I also discovered, to quote from an interview on Ask Papa Bear, the first advice column for furries, that what separates furries from monster lovers is their presentation. I don't have a monster persona. I wouldn't want one. I adore them, but don't want to be a monster. I do have and enjoy having personas though. I see it as being a cute fat possum doing my normal life things. Monsters rarely fit into society and break the norms. Furries can be monster folks, but monsters don't work in reverse as easily. And also, monster kinks do not promote violence. I see this a lot with basically any socially atypical kink. As soon as people hear about it, they think, oh my gosh, that must promote violence, that's deviant, that's bad for women and society, and there is no study I know of that indicates that there is a connection between the normalization of violence and being into monster kinks. I think if there is a connection between those two things, I would say it's more likely that having a monster kink is a reaction to violence, especially sexual violence, already being normalized against you. We know from other previous studies that queer women, and especially non-binary people and trans folk, are more likely to be subjected to sexual violence than other groups are. And so naturally, I think that maybe indicates a potential connection where, okay, maybe having a monster kink for at least some people is a way of coping with the normalization of violence you already have to deal with and experience. It is well known that for a lot of people, sexual fantasies are a tool that is beneficial to be able to deal with uncomfortable or inescapable facts like embarrassment, shame, fear. Things like that can oftentimes lead to the creation or interest in a particular kink. And also, if you are somebody who has experienced something negative, I think this can be a way to recapture and recreate certain things that have happened with a layer of abstraction put on top that makes it more digestible and able to be processed and worked through, such that you are able to cope with the reality that you dealt with on a more ongoing basis in a less intense way than maybe you did before. It can help ease that guilt and shame that may be associated with memories of previous negative events that have happened to you. But on the topic of exploring fantasies, I want to talk about how you can explore your monster kinks in real life a little bit if you want to. I think this is absolutely a fantasy you can choose to just like keep inside your brain if you want to, but for a lot of people, they would love the opportunity to explore their kink more in real life with a partner if they only knew how. And I find it very interesting because I think with any fantasy, it's very rare for us to fully explore one-to-one in person, in real life, in a scene. Like if we have a fantasy about being a Victorian maid serving a vampire lord, we might transmute that into doing a service on the weekend for your partner while wearing a maid outfit, and you make them rare steak and serve them red wine or something. You know, we get a little hints of the fantasy in the reality, but reality very rarely closely replicates a fantasy. Like a lot of people, you know, we're not fantasizing about having a flogging at a crowded dungeon where the music is too loud and our feet are cramping and we can't make eye contact with our partner and we feel kind of out of place and self-conscious, and like, you know, our realities do not usually reflect our fantasies. Our fantasies are much more like, you know, I'm a captured princess and I'm being flogged because I tried to escape or something, you know, like that's much more commonly the actual fantasy, and then suddenly it turns into being flogged on a Friday night at a local dungeon, you know, like, so if you want to recreate a little bit of a monster kink, you don't have to one-to-one try to make your fantasy into reality exactly. You can get just little versions of it, little beats that are really important to you here and there in your everyday experience or in your scenes, and that can be very rewarding and very effective for scratching that itch in real life. So what are some ways in the kink community that people let out their monster fantasies? I think one very common option is pet play, especially pet play relationships where there's a dual pet dynamic or one more dominant creature and a pet. So for example, I know couples where the dominant partner is a dragon and the submissive partner is a raccoon or a fox or something. You can also have pet play dynamics where the dominant is a werewolf and the submissive is a puppy, which I find to be very cute. One other common outlet is, of course, primal play. Primal play is very, very popular for monster kinks, and you hear all the time scene ideas from people where they're a werewolf or a caged beast or a minotaur or something, and that's how they express their primal play, and they use monster roleplay as a way to do that. And if your kink is a little bit more cerebral, things like hypnosis or service submission are popular choices if you have a vampire or a demon-centered fantasy. And of course, we have to mention takedown and capture and wrestling and rough body play. That goes part and parcel with a lot of primal play as well, but they are technically separate things. And a lot of people love doing scenes where they're wrestling and growling and biting and all of that to express their monstrous side or the desire for a monstrous partner. But if you want to, I think you can go more direct with your role play. And listen, I am not like an ex-theater kid. I'm not really great at like fully costumed, different persona than who I really am type roleplay. That's not my bag whatsoever. And like, applause for you, seriously, if you can pull that off, because I find it to be very, very difficult. But if you don't want to necessarily do a full-on production with like set pieces and a costume and having to do an accent for 3 straight hours or something, I think there's like little ways you can add in elements of all of that into your role play if you are willing to instead use the theater of the mind rather than a physical theater. For example, let's say you have a fantasy about a werewolf and you get your partner a pair of like metal claws, you get a blindfold, you get a good moody soundtrack, you put some earbuds in to listen to the soundtrack while you're playing, and then while your partner is running their metal claws up and down your body, they can growl in your ear, they can whisper to you about how your body looks so good and so tender and they can't wait to take a bite or something like that, where you are fully enveloped in just the fantasy world of having this werewolf lover put their claws all over your body, but you don't actually have to have your partner wearing a full-on werewolf costume or a mask or something if you don't want them to. And I'm sure that by itself, for people that have been waiting to explore their kink for a very long time, that is going to be a very, very hot scenario. But if you're feeling a little nervous, if you're not really good at the talking part of doing a scene with your partner, you're not really that much of a verbal person, don't worry, you definitely have options to make this easier. Like, don't be afraid to take advantage of ASMR, because listen, there is a whole subgenre of ASMR roleplay that is just monster boyfriend kink fantasy. So keep those headphones on, get some sensory deprivation gear going, load up a playlist of hours of werewolf boyfriend content, pop it in there and get some bondage going and maybe tie them up, put them in mummification or a straitjacket or just whatever you want to do. Lay them out on a bed or a couch or on a chair or something and just let them float away into their ideal fantasy landscape while you tease them and poke them and claw them and bite them, growl in their ear, breathe along their neck, whatever you think goes along to their ASMR fantasy. And that can be a very fun and also low effort, quiet scene to do, especially if you have a lot of people around your house or you're traveling or something. Good option for that too. Now, one other very obvious suggestion, if you prefer playing more with downstairs parts of your anatomy, is to get an anatomically correct toy from some of the very diverse silicone vendors that are over on Etsy. And, you know, with the right amount of lube and the right setting and lighting, really anything is possible if you are somebody that is more inclined to want to play with your existing downstairs tools. I hate that I have to talk about it like this, but it truly is the only way. And if you want to explore more of the physical side with wrestling, rough body play, all of that, I highly recommend taking some classes. Please do that stuff safely, because rough body play and wrestling, it is dangerous. People think of like bondage and like choking as being dangerous. People always skip over wrestling, okay? Wrestling can be very dangerous. It can be super rewarding and very fun, but you gotta know how to do it in a safer way. So please take some classes, learn some stuff. There's tons of resources inside the kink community, but if you really don't have that near where you live, you can take classes for judo or aikido or wrestling classes, or even like self-defense classes too, and use the information you get from those classes to inform your kink practices so you are doing it in a safer way. But with that being said, that is really all I have to share about monster kinks. I would love to know y'all's thoughts about this one in a comment down below. Do you have a monster kink? Have you ever done it in real life with a partner? Have you ever explored that role play? If you do have a monster kink, what is your favorite monster, and is it a vampire? Also, there is so much with monster kinks that I didn't even get into in this video. So if you guys have more questions I didn't answer here, please let me know in a comment down below if I should make a follow-up video and what I should cover in that, because I would love to talk more about this kink. And also, if you're not already, if you would like to, please do subscribe, because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of different kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best we can do that is with Patreon. A link to that will be down below. If you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.